Hey, Giorgio, you dropped. Um, let me repeat my last question to you.
Yeah, sorry there, I got kicked out.
Not a problem. Um, Scotty's putting me on the hot tin roof, but anyway, that's okay. So, what initially drew you to the world of ESG, and how has your journey been in this space?
So I think that as for many in the sustainability and sustainability consulting space, the seek of finding purpose in your daily activity, it's a big driver, especially considering that for my generation, for the younger generation, this is not becoming an aspirational goal or target. It's more a paramount challenge that we have to face. So
Hmm.
being able to commingle my previous experience in more conventional financial space with the drive of trying to contribute to this challenge, which is one of the greatest that we are going to face that we are facing and that we're going to face in the coming years. I think that personally was a big reason.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I hear you on that. That's for sure. It is certainly one of our biggest challenges. So perhaps let's move into what ESG is all about for those who perhaps don't understand or don't know about it. So, for those who are kind of new to the concept, could you provide a clear definition of ESG and explain its significance in today's business landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. And to do that, you will allow me that I take a step back,
Sure.
meaning that sustainability is a broad topic that encompass various definition. And if we would have to picture it um, as a bucket that fills various components. Within the sustainability space, we have sustainable business practice, we have
Hmm.
sustainable investing, and we have sustainable development. And
Hmm.
lastly, we also have sustainable consumption. Those sub-buckets are mainly focused for various group within our complicated world. If you can think about sustainable business practice as something that mainly refers to companies' practices. Sustainable
Hmm.
investing, it's mainly focused on investors and banks. Sustainable
Hmm.
development, it's often referred to as something that countries and nations have to deal with. And sustainable consumption, it comes down to the individual level. So um,
Okay.
within those sub buckets, ESG is a concept that it's in the middle between sustainable investing and sustainable business practices. To go on the definition, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and we'll touch upon each of those shortly. And within ESG, you have other type of concepts such as climate risk management, climate finance,
Mhm.
corporate climate goals. And next to ESG, more on the sustainable development side, you have ultimately climate policies. And those are, in fact, impacted by businesses, both in terms of business lobbying as well as simply stakeholder needs. So this is more to create a clear picture of what sustainability looks
Mhm.
like. And within that, you have climate change or the impact of climate change, which is a which doesn't fall specifically any major sustainability definition, but it's a cross-cutting effect that touches all of those buckets that I just mentioned.
Cool. Okay. And how do you think the perception and importance of ESG has evolved over the past few years, and what trends do you foresee in the near future?
So while the concept of ESG arises from the concept of corporate social responsibility, which is something that around the 80s, 90s, with all the studies, scientific studies that were arising concerning our status quo business practices,
Hmm.
started to theorize that company may be better off in adding a certain purpose to what they were doing, since they would impact stakeholders as a whole, both consumers, countries, and the economy as a whole. And it's a big challenge that corporate social responsibility arose because from the 60s, economists always considered that the sole purpose of a business was to create value for its shareholders. No social values in the picture, no social drive whatsoever, just maximize shareholder value. And this has been conventional finance since the 60s. So ESG tried to piggyback on top of corporate social responsibility around 2005, 2006 or so, when this acronym was coined. And now it's of relevant importance to companies, first from an aspirational point of view, but now, as we are seeing with policy changes throughout the world, it's even becoming a regulatory requirement in some sense. So even those which are more skeptical or did not recognize value in it needs to some extent comply, and maybe we'll delve on how and why.
Sure. Okay, great. So yeah, we'll come back to some of the skeptics just now, I'm sure. We will do that for sure. So let's talk about the E in ESG, and let's begin by asking you, how do companies typically approach and integrate environmental considerations into their ESG strategies?
Right. So as you mentioned, the E stands for environmental, and this aspect focuses on companies' impact on the environment. Well, investors and stakeholders try to assess how a company manages and use its natural resources, its carbon footprint, energy efficiency, its waste, and so on. And companies with strong environmental practice are more likely to be viewed as responsible or sustainable. So this is the premise on what it is and what it signals. How company itself approach it, it differs, and the reason why it differs is because each companies have and might have different material issues to them. If you are a company in a certain industry, the way in which you could tackle environmental concerns may differ completely from a company in both another geographical space or another business sector. The way in which it's practically being done is through accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. It's accounting for the product life cycles in case of a company producing a product, and it implies that a company first, in order to manage what their environmental concerns may be, starts measuring them. And this shift, it's also being stimulated by the fact that, as I mentioned, while before companies were doing this for their own stakeholders, or in case of publicly listed companies to signal something to the employee, now with the regulations occurring in the EU and coming up in the US, companies are required to report on this, especially starting from large companies rolling down to smaller and smaller companies. So in order to be able to report greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, they need to quantify and measure them. And this doesn't, this obviously means a lot of challenges for companies that are not used to perform in this space.
Cool. Okay. And can you share some success stories or notable examples of companies effectively addressing environmental concerns within their ESG framework?
Right. Well, I would avoid focusing on a specific company or a specific example. Rather, I want to mention what literature often does, and by doing that, they group companies and try to benchmark them to see whether there is a material difference in some of the value drivers based on their environmental performance. And while the question of this podcast is, do sustainable companies perform better? I tend to be a devil's advocate, and therefore it's important to understand, one, what sustainable means, and two, what performance means. However, even though, as I mentioned, it's difficult to measure those two things in space, there are several academic papers that have focused on as a proxy for economic success, stock value or return on investments or cost of capital, and as a proxy for sustainability, material sustainable targets, either self-imposed or mandated by executive. And what they've seen is that companies that focus on a handful of material environmental target ultimately signal something to investors, which are willing to invest in the company. Therefore, they might experience a positive reflection in their share price, and at the same company, being more resilient may signify a lower cost of capital, which ultimately translate in higher returns on investments. So while I haven't focused on a specific example, there is a handful of literature out there that tries to quantify exactly that, and the results are promising. But the focus here is not sustainable per se, not greenwashing and claims, rather focus on a key handful material impacts that the company can focus on.
Cool. Okay, so just a reminder to our guests that we're speaking to Giorgio and about ESG today. And if you'd like to ask some questions, please do. The floor is yours. Anytime you want, just put up your hand and we'll take your questions. Okay, so some social factors, let's look at those. So obviously turning to the S in ESG, how do organizations navigate and incorporate social factors into their ESG initiatives?
Right. So the social factor and the social component, let's say, looks at how company manages its relationships with its employees, customers, suppliers, and the community in which it operates. And key social factor, in fact, include labor practices, human rights, diversity and inclusion, which is a big one, employee overall well-being, as well as community engagement. And while this differs across the world significantly, companies are now even required to ensure that their supply chain is in order with respect to social factors. We have seen how many large corporations that might have their part of their supply chain in countries other than the one in which their executive operates, that they have been under some weather for consideration of labors across the sea, of overall well-being of how the products are being made, and even internally to those companies, better, like wider issues such as diversity and inclusion, a number of female executives within the firms are becoming increasingly and critically important.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so in your experience, what are some of the key challenges companies face when addressing social issues, and how can they overcome these challenges?
Actually, this is a very good question, because in the world that we are facing and that we'll face even more, diversity is a big and huge issue. So being able to, at any organization, being able to manage such a diverse pool of people in terms of geographical diversity. You can think of me as an Italian working for a US company in the US. Diverse in terms of gender diversity. It's increasingly important for companies to understand what they are managing, to understand the different cultural backgrounds, and this can unleash a huge amount of benefits through the combination of backgrounds, of the combination of talents and skills that including a wide variety of people and not the usual suspects can have at an organization. However, this comes with clear challenges in terms of respecting people's different religious holidays. And I'm giving more concrete example now, or being able to understand the different in the employee life cycle when a family it's brought into the picture, and so changing those corporate rules that have been the same for many years to accommodate the diversity pool that companies are now hiring from.
Cool. Yeah, okay. So looking at governance factors and shifting to the G in ESG, how does governance play a role in the overall sustainability and responsibility of a company?
Yeah, this goes on top of what I just mentioned about the workforce, because governance mainly focus on how diverse is the internal structure and management of a company. It involves examining company's leadership, the board of directors structure, executive compensation, shareholders' rights, and other ethical business practices at a more higher layer than the company workforce. So oftentimes what we just talked about, so the workforce, it's often a reflection of companies' executives within a company. So if you have a variety of people within the board, both in terms of geographical variety, skills variety, gender variety, this often leads to a more inclusive workforce as well. And therefore, the way that a company manages that internally becomes critical in then executing the various daily tasks that create a corporation. And another example of this is executive compensation. Oftentimes, we've seen in how the corporate structure that we live in creates a wide range of compensation between executives and employees, with executives earning 10, 100, 1,000x more than its employees producing or delivering the service that the company does. So aligning, for instance, executive compensation to sustainability targets could have massive impacts in how then a company delivers its purpose through the work that they do. So governance, it's more about providing these inclusions criteria that we talked about for the labor structure, but also aligning interest between shareholders, a company purpose, and its executives.
Yeah, that's interesting. Are you aware of any companies that are starting to look more seriously at things like salary alignment and shareholders and so on in comparison to the general workers or the general employees of the company?
Absolutely.
Okay.
While many publicly listed companies still have a strong difference of compensation, but an hour wouldn't be enough to discuss the fairness, the moral consideration, and even the responsibilities, perhaps arguing the other perspective on those. Many publicly listed companies are trying to include certain compensation targets for executives that achieve predetermined sustainability targets. So that's a trend that's definitely becoming more prominent, even at very large corporations.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is driving that? Do you think it's stakeholders, or do you think it's the company executives themselves, or is it just kind of public perception of the company that's driving that sort of behavior?
Yeah, that's another very good question, because I think reasons, it's not a clear-cut answer, but it's a bit of a combination of things. On one end, we have seen previous to these regulatory requirements that are coming up that investors were mainly the drivers of this. So they would require a company that would invest in to have certain of these techniques in place. On another hand, it's also consumer based. A company that's been highly held by people that are increasingly looking at these factors as something that has a strong impact in everyone's life, in stakeholders' lives, then ultimately drives companies to do so. On the other hand, you might have companies that are more pioneering those efforts. In various industries, you always have more enlightened individuals that may be the one driving these changes and then getting everyone on board. And for many, it has become a strategic tool as well, kind of a first mover advantage over the years of being able to claim that they were doing those efforts. And that brought another trend, which is greenwashing, excuse me, which, let's say, made companies make claims that weren't actually fulfilled. And that's a whole different conversation. So to briefly answer your question, in some hand, you might have enlightened executives that pioneer this. On another hand, you may have investors requiring it. And ultimately, something that we should never forget, consumers play a big role onto companies' practices too.
Absolutely. So yeah, so it's some director action and shareholder action, and then obviously the consumers or the community in which they exist. Yeah, yeah, I kind of see that. Yeah, that's great. Something that I also wanted to ask you is what do you think are some of the challenges that face people who want to try and bring about these changes within companies to try and draw that salary gap together? What are the sort of challenges that they run into?
In businesses are very different in terms of the industry they operate, the size of the business, the ownership of the business, and so on and so forth. So it's difficult to find once again a clear-cutting answers to all those many environments and cases. Let's say that for companies that are publicly traded, those changes are becoming more mandatory. So the challenges that they face, it's more an adaptation challenge to those changes than an initiation one. For smaller companies, and for smaller, I mean, even companies that might have more freedom, let's say in pursuing those type of initiatives, the main challenge that I see is, but we have always done like that. So changes is always seen skeptically, especially for companies that have performed well. So the main challenge that I see on those group of individuals is the difficulty in changing something that has always been in a certain way.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think like trying to change something that has always been done in a particular way, that does bring about some serious challenges.
And even in, sorry, Michael, even in smaller processes within a company, one of the red flags that always and oftentimes appear is the phrase "we've always done like that." It doesn't have to be to change executives' compensation to align it with sustainable practice, but it's even on a daily task basis. Changes is always something that people are often afraid of, as if the workforce doesn't have enough turnover, intergenerational or inter-skill from those points of view, then it's difficult to make those type of decision and changes ultimately.
Cool. Okay, and what are some of the best practices for companies to enhance their governance structures and ensure accountability within their ESG framework?
Yeah, well, after you focus on a few key material impacts for what we can consider the environmental concerns, after you change some of your social factor accounting for all those moral issues that we have discussed, making changes at the board level requires interaction of a few parties. And all the stakeholders should be involved within this decision, and accounting for what your employees want, accounting for what your end consumers want, as well as your shareholders. It's the best way to proceed forward in adapting those changes. And I'm not saying that every company should have a 50-50 structure, or any company should look the same way. I'm saying that starting discussions with the wider range of stakeholders, it's probably the best tool the company have, by sending out employee survey, by reaching out to their consumers, by having discussions with the wider range of their shareholders. It's the best tool that they have to reflect those wills within their structure.
For sure. All right, let's take a look at something else now. Let's take a look at measuring impact and how companies measure and report their ESG performance, and what are the key metrics that stakeholders should pay attention to.
That's another great question, because as I mentioned before, going back to the title of this chat, do sustainable company perform better? The two major components that we need to highlight is, what does sustainable means and what does performance means? Well, in the space of ESG, the key metrics that needs to be emphasized at any company level are, I would say, mainly two, and those are related to physical climate risk and transition climate risk. Those two concepts are, and I'm going to focus on transition risk to begin with. This focus on, we are going to transition towards an economy which is going to tend to be carbon neutral. Are we doing enough to measure our greenhouse gas emissions and to report on it and to try to minimize it? So, for instance, within the space of this transition, being able to measure, quantify, and report on your greenhouse gas emission becomes paramount. And greenhouse gas emission, it's often referred to as three types of greenhouse gas emissions: Scope 1, Scope 2, and 3. This is how they're often referred in the industry. Refer to Scope 1, a company's direct greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 2, it's the energy that they use to produce their services. And Scope 3, it's all across the supply chain. So while those key metrics are clearly defined, being able to account for it, it's a big challenge, because it has never done before, unless some have done it from an aspirational perspective. And a lot of companies find challenges in for instance, quantifying upstream and downstream their supply chain, what they call the Scope 3 emissions, because they were never considering that as part of their own greenhouse gas emission, which is clearly the case. On the physical climate risk aspect, this is more how much does my company's products, or how much do my company's service are exposed to physical climate risk concerns. This could be change in heat, in sea level rise, and these ultimately cause impact to the business bottom line. If we think about the heat as one of the main consideration as we're going towards a warmer climate, there have been plenty of studies showing the negative relationship between higher heat, lower performance, especially in certain industry. So being able to understand those dynamics and adjust to it, it's also becoming increasingly important. This goes down to the individual employee level, as per the example for heat, but it also impacts a company's assets and asset values. So if I own a facility which is in an area prone to a climate hazard, you can think it of as a building located in the coast and sea level rise. If I'm not well accounting for the changes that I need to make to make this structure more resilient, I might not be valuing my asset correctly. So being able to reevaluate on your asset and on your product from a physical climate risk perspective, being able to evaluate on your greenhouse gas emissions from a transition risk perspective, it's something that companies can nowadays quickly do to assess their performance in this space.
Excellent. Yeah, great. Yes, I've read a bit about the environmental issues that are facing companies these days and how they must account for them, because obviously it increases their risk quite significantly going forward if they don't pay attention to it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And this brought me into a tangent, Michael, which is another aspect of ESG that, as we started with the definitions at the beginning of this talk, is critically important. It's climate change risk. And I'm very passionate about it because I have the feeling that companies are not taking into consideration those risks at face value, and oftentimes they are not only not considered, but when they are underestimated. And the reason for this is not because companies are not doing enough. It's because oftentimes, especially in the financial industries, our tools to measure it are not well equipped to do so. And I'll give you an example without going too technical on this, but in the valuation space, valuation of an asset of a company and whatnot, the tools oftentimes used are one of the major valuation tools used. It's a model called a discounted cash flow model. This allows you to forecast an asset or a company's future earnings, and through the concept of a time value of money, it discounts it to find a present value of all this future cash flow. And feel free to stop me if I'm not being clear, because this is somewhat technical, but I think it's important to understand why we have such a short-term myopic view on the issue. Once this is done, the concept of the discount rate, which allows you to bring back to the present all those future cash flows, it's critically important. And the way that we proxy risk at the moment, it's by increasing this discount rate, which is the denominator of this formula. The problem with this is that while this is a good tool, assuming that all future cash flows are positive, when those are not, we are simply underestimating all the costs happening 20, 30 years down the line. So for instance, in the case of climate risk, where an investment is needed today to add resiliency to a building, to an asset, or to a company, and the benefits of this are only seen 20, 30 years down the line, you can see now by those models and these standards, every benefit is extremely underestimated, and all the costs that are occurring today are seen as prohibitive. On the opposite side, the cost of not acting, so not investing today, with the potential future negative effect happening only that 20, 30 years down the line, by the discounting factor, so by the same reason as before, all those negative effects are minimized using the same methods. So professionals in this field are trying to drift away from conventional valuation methods when looking at these topics, and are trying, even in some case, to develop their own valuation methods, which may shift this myopic next quarter type of mentality for a more long-term view on companies, on businesses, on the economy. And from a more philosophical point of view, now shifting from the technical to the more moral items, I think that we are lacking this type of approach. And companies, publicly traded companies, are oftentimes way too focused on next quarter results, because that's how their compensation often it's been measured, to a more long-term approach to the issue.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, what you're talking about is quite a cultural shift within companies, because obviously, you know, present view and past view of investment is that the return on the investment needs to be quick. Otherwise, it's just not something that's palatable for them. And now they're starting to talk about very long-term investments, which won't share benefits for many, many years, as you mentioned. That must be quite challenging for both company directors and for shareholders to swallow. Yeah,
it is quite challenging, and sometimes it's simply that the tools are not yet out there to be able to reflect the importance of those changes. So it's not only hard because companies don't want to do it. It's simply that the tools are coming into play in during these years, and using the old ones doesn't allow to fully capture that.
All right. Just a reminder to the folks that are listening and watching. I'm talking to Giorgio Castro today. He is an ESG SME, which means subject matter expert, and we're just chatting generally about ESG and how companies are having to adapt and adopt new ways of doing business and managing themselves. So yeah, that's what we're doing. If you've got any questions, please do ask. You can pop them in the chat if you want to, and we'll field them and get to them. Or if you just want to put your hand up and ask a question, please do go ahead. So let's move on to some of the challenges and opportunities in the ESG field, and let's talk about what some of the common challenges companies face when implementing ESG initiatives, and how they can turn these challenges into opportunities.
Yeah, I think, Michael, if you agree, we talked a lot about the challenges so far, the challenges of implementing, the challenges of change, the challenges of the tools, while we haven't talked, I think, yet on the opportunity side of things. And this is equally important, because oftentimes the company don't realize how investment in resilient infrastructure, investment in renewable energy do impact their bottom line, and quite significantly so. In the most simple example that I can offer you, investing to reduce your scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, so how you source your internal electricity, shifting to solar or renewable energy reduces your operational cost. And there have been many studies that show how the price of those technologies, which have continuously dropped over the last 10 years, it's now a no-brainer to be implemented wherever possible, at the household level, but even at a company level. And at the same time, if we're looking more at the investor perspective, being able to invest in a company which is more resilient than another in the climate change, from the climate change risk lens, also ensures higher return in the long run. Once again, and I tend to go back to the challenges, because without overcoming those opportunities cannot be unlocked. If you have a very short-term investment horizon, you may not be, let's say, stimulated or motivated to pursue certain type of investment. But if we look for the perspective of a large asset owner, such as a pension fund, for instance, which have a long-term fiduciary duty to their pensioners, it's critically important to evaluate companies under the sustainability and climate risk lens to ensure that this fiduciary duty can be met. And there are several pension funds, mutual funds, so large asset owners, even companies that you may not be completely aligned from a moral perspective because they own a large variety of assets, such as BlackRock, is now mandating its analysts to evaluate those criteria when making a portfolio investment or an investment decision. So from the large asset owner perspective, the opportunities are several in investing in resilient infrastructure and investing in resilient and sustainable companies compared to let's say a non-action or a status quo type of investment approach. I always refer to this as the typewriter paradox. If we are back in the 1960, 1950, investing in a typewriter business may be in line with what done in the past, but not acknowledging that the shift from that towards a more computer-based type of writing, it's simply a poor financial decision. Or so investing in a company which is highly involved with oil production, coal production, it's not becoming something which is a sacrifice for companies, or to give up those profits to seek something else. It's becoming a poor financial judgment based on a 20, 30, 50-year time where the economy is gonna shift towards a net zero carbon neutral type of economy.
Yeah, I'm interested in that. I mean, you touched on a couple of things in that part of your response. You talked about pensioners, and yes, they're a big deal. And they do have, I mean, obviously a company has a responsibility to them for sure. Something else that I wanted to just briefly touch on, because we're going to start running out of time soon, is the fact that a lot of oil companies and companies that are quite large emitters of carbon gases and various other things are starting to turn to CCS systems, which is carbon capture systems, to try and clean their environment, but they're not actually stopping looking for oil and things like that. So there's no real change there, and I see that as being a bit of a challenge that has to be kind of like viewed and discussed in terms of ESG. What do you feel about that?
No, I agree with you. At the same time, though, I recognize that a lot of these companies are managed by extremely smart individuals, and they have recognized, and if you would put together the largest investors in fossil fuel with the largest contributor to renewable energy, in this list you're going to find a lot of similar names. So so a lot of companies are starting to realize and even capitalize on those changes, even coming from those type of sectors. At the same time, we have to deal with with something that's beyond our control, which is energy demands. We, as a growing economy, are going to require a huge amount of energy, and we still do. And the only way to meet in the short term this demand is, unfortunately, from conventional energy source. A lot of people feel that this change is not happening quick enough, and they may agree with that. At the same time, though, it's important to mention that options such as divesting, so many claim that a large pension fund or a large mutual fund that is currently invested in certain companies in the fossil fuel sector, divesting simply means passing the responsibility to someone else. Divesting often means that someone else is buying. Actually, it purely means that. I think they might be better off in the concept of engaging. So large asset owner can be extremely powerful as a tool to make changes in these companies. And even when executives are not currently realizing, large asset owners can influence those decisions. So I think that this is a much better strategy to unleash the power that those large energy corporations have in pave the way for a greener, sustainable future, rather than simply marginalize and divesting, which to me doesn't fully reflect the right intentions in doing so.
Yeah. Yeah, you're touching on a subject which is interesting to me too, in terms of energy generation. And I have obviously there are challenges on both sides of the spectrum, from generation and transmission, and a lot of people don't appreciate that. And I think that there's also a certain amount of misinformation around about that. It's not simply a question of plugging something into a wall and you've got instant power. It needs to get to that plug, and there are many challenges along the way, and big challenges that are going to cost lots of money going forward. And I'm aware of that. But I don't have time to ask you more questions down that road, because we're running out of time. So I want to start to wrap up, and then Rahul has a question as well. So let me just ask you to give us some of your views about the future. As we look to the future, how do you envision the role of ESG evolving, and what challenges can we expect in the next, or what changes rather can we expect in the next decade?
So to start with that, I hate trying to predict the future. At the same time, my job requires it, and oftentimes we say that we transform an uncertainty into a mistake. Meaning that while we can't be absolutely right about the future state of anything, because no one really can, we can at least try to proxy it and get as close, wrongly, but as close as we can. So there are a lot of studies made into such as shared economic pathways, such as other future forecasts of the energy market, of the economy, which are much more robust than my personal opinion. So I would refer to those when I think about the future state of this space. We are coming to different decisions, and every action that we take implies a certain direction. We can decide to let intergovernmental relationship impact the way that we transition, as we've done in the case of the Russian-Ukraine war with the European energy market, and you may be familiar with that, Michael. Or we can decide to do a business as usual situation, trying to maximize profit over purpose, and this may lead to a completely different scenario, both in terms of Celsius degree above pre-industrial level, and as a consequence in terms of the life that we'll live in. All those type of scenarios that the International Energy Agency, that the UN develop, allows us to calculate the different state of the climate, and as a consequence, different state of companies' required adaptation. And while I wouldn't be able to put my money in any of those, since unpredictable change can happen 1 year from the next, we simply have to keep moving forward to pursue what we believe is the future we want to live in. And I say this from a personal level. And if we all do this at the individual level, then certainly larger companies and larger asset owner will shift that mentality too.
For sure. Yeah. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left, and what I want to do is just give you Rahul's question. So Rahul asks, what are your thoughts about offsetting practices going on in the industry for residual emissions? Did you get that? Shall I read it again, or did you get that?
No, I just opened the chat. Thanks,
cool.
Thanks, Rahul. I think it's an interesting thought, because it may be required to achieve our short-term targets in terms of carbon release in the atmosphere. At the same time, though, we have seen over the past that certain tools like carbon offsetting haven't been quite as impactful as they were promised to do. And we've seen a lot of companies that would use those carbon offset to make claims without being too concerned of the real source of this offsetting. I do believe in technology such as carbon capture and sequestration. I do believe in companies being more concerned about ecosystem protections and all those sorts of techniques. At the same time, if we're looking at the actual carbon offset market, that did not play as intended or as expected. At the same time, it's still I would say a good source, especially for those industries that are not able to quickly enough make the change as it might occur in other industries. So I do still feel that there is value in that.
Great. So we have come to the end of our time, basically.
My
we
pleasure,
have about,
Robin.
and it's been really great to talk to you. It's lovely to meet you, and it's been a good talk. Thanks so much. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you,
and
Michael and Scott, for hosting me. It's been a nice discussion, and yeah,
yeah, great. Well, we'll do it again sometime. Thanks so
will
much.
do.
Great, guys. We are done.